The phone call came at 12:01 a.m. In the 6 years Ava Wade had worked for George Parkin, she had never once contacted him after business hours. Not when she'd worked through pneumonia to close the Vancouver deal. Not when a rival family's enforcer had followed her home, and she'd changed apartments without mentioning it. Not even when George's previous assistant had disappeared under suspicious circumstances and Ava had spent 72 sleepless hours erasing every digital trace of the man's indiscretions. But tonight, perched on a cold metal bench in the downtown precinct's holding area, her tailored blazer torn at the sleeve and dried blood crusted on her split knuckles, she had run out of options. "One call, Princess." The detective leaned against the bars, his badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. Detective Ramos wore his authority like cheap cologne, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. "Make it count." Ava's fingers didn't shake as she dialed the number burned into her memory. Each ring stretched into infinity. He wouldn't answer. Why would he? It was past midnight and she was merely his personal assistant. Composed, invisible, flawlessly efficient Ava Wade, who had never made a single misstep in 6 years. Until tonight. "Speak." The voice cut through the silence, rough from sleep but still carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who controlled half the city's underground. "Mr. Parkin." Her voice remained steady despite the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. "I apologize for the hour, but I'm being held at the downtown precinct and they've permitted one phone call and I don't have anyone." "Location." The sleep had evaporated from his tone, replaced by something cold and precise. "Downtown station, holding room C." She swallowed, tasting copper where she'd bitten through her lip during the altercation. There was a situation at the Velvet Room during the exchange. The authorities are alleging assault, but the context was, I did strike someone, but only after. "Stop talking." The command sliced through her explanation. "Not to the detectives. Not to anyone. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The line went dead. Ava stared at the phone in her hand, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. George Parkin, the man who made district attorneys resign and business empires crumble, was personally coming to retrieve his arrested assistant at midnight. "So," Detective Ramos raised an eyebrow, his smirk deepening. "Boyfriend playing hero?" "He's not my boyfriend." The words came out sharper than intended. "He's my employer." Must be one hell of an employer to show up at midnight. The detective's expression made Ava want to demonstrate exactly how she'd earned those bloodied knuckles. She'd called him a glorified mall cop with delusions of competence during processing. Not her most professional moment. The precinct existed in shades of institutional beige and bureaucratic gray. Overhead fluorescence cast everything in a sickly pallor. The air tasted of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the sharp tang of fear from the drunk tank 2 doors down. Ava's hand still bore black ink residue from fingerprinting, and she could feel each bruise blooming across her knuckles where she'd connected with that woman's jaw. What was her name? Victoria. Vanessa. She'd been whispering in Marco Sloane's ear, her manicured fingers on his forearm, making promises about shipment routes and loose ends that needed tying. The same Marco Sloane whose family had been circling George's territory for months. 6 months of careful planning, and Ava had been so close to securing the ledger that would expose the Sloane syndicate's entire network. Then Vanessa had spotted her, recognized her, and Ava had made a choice. For 6 years, Ava Wade had been the invisible architect of George Parkin's empire, the one who anticipated threats before they materialized, who sanitized crime scenes from spreadsheets, who kept his darkest secrets locked behind her perfect composure. She had never broken character. She had never slipped. She had never needed saving. Until tonight, when George Parkin walked through those precinct doors at exactly 12:16 a.m., dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than Detective Ramos's annual salary, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't glance at the officers. He didn't acknowledge the protocol. He simply looked at Ava through the bars, his expression unreadable, and the entire precinct seemed to hold its breath. He didn't just bail her out. He claimed her. And in that moment, the carefully constructed wall between employer and employee, between criminal and accomplice, between George Parkin and Ava Wade, began to crack. Because the man who had built an empire on emotional detachment had just revealed his only weakness. And she was sitting in a holding cell with blood on her hands and his secrets on her lips. This was the moment everything changed. The moment George Parkin stopped seeing his assistant and started seeing the woman he'd been trying not to want for 6 years. The moment Ava Wade realized that her job had stopped being professional the first time she'd agreed to make evidence disappear. And the moment the Sloan Syndicate realized that the untouchable George Parkin finally had a vulnerability worth exploiting. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 2,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to 2000 and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. George Parkin didn't walk into the downtown precinct so much as he displaced the air itself. The double doors swung open at 12:16 a.m., and every conversation in the lobby died mid-sentence. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that cost more than most officers made in 3 months, the wool catching the sickly fluorescent light as he moved. His attorney Marcus Chun, no relation to anyone Ava knew, trailed 2 steps behind, already pulling paperwork from an oxblood leather briefcase. Ava watched through the holding cell bars as Detective Ramos straightened, his earlier smirk evaporating. The sergeant at the front desk picked up his phone, then set it down again without dialing. Even the drunk in the adjacent cell had gone quiet. Mr. Parkin. The desk sergeant's voice carried a deference that hadn't been there 30 minutes ago. We weren't expecting. My assistant. George's voice cut through the institutional air like a blade through silk. Where is she? Sir, there's protocol for bail hearings. The arraignment isn't until. Marcus. George didn't look at his attorney. He didn't need to. The lawyer stepped forward, sliding a folder across the scarred desk. You'll find the judge's signature authorizing immediate release, pending formal charges, which, upon review of the circumstances, I suspect will be dropped by morning. The woman Ms. Wade allegedly assaulted has connections to an ongoing federal investigation. I imagine the district attorney will find pressing reasons to make this disappear. Ava's breath caught. George had secured a judge's signature in 15 minutes. At midnight. For her. Detective Ramos appeared beside the cell, keys jangling. The condescension had vanished from his expression, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. Or fear. You're free to go, Ms. Wade. The lock clicked open with a finality that seemed to echo through Ava's chest. She stepped out, acutely aware of her torn blazer, the dried blood still crusted on her knuckles, the way her usually immaculate appearance had been reduced to evidence of violence. George's gaze swept over her, cataloging every detail with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when his eyes lingered on the bruising starting to purple along her cheekbone. Thank you for your cooperation, Detective. Marcus was already ushering them toward the exit. We'll be in touch regarding the release of Ms. Wade's personal effects. They moved through the precinct in a bubble of silence. Officers parted without being asked. The desk sergeant didn't request a signature. By the time they reached the parking lot, Ava's hands had started to shake, the adrenaline finally catching up to her forced composure. A black Mercedes idled at the curb, engine purring. Not George's usual driver. George himself opened the rear door, his hand settling at the small of Ava's back with a possessiveness he'd never shown before. The touch burned through her ruined blazer. Your apartment isn't secure. His voice was low, meant only for her. You're staying at the estate tonight. Not a question. Not a suggestion. Ava slid into the leather seat, her mind still processing the shift. The way he'd looked at her in that cell, the judge's midnight signature, the hand on her back that lingered a fraction too long. For 6 years, she'd been the invisible solution to his problems. Tonight, she'd become the problem he couldn't delegate. The door closed with a decisive click. George settled beside her in the darkness, and the driver pulled away from the precinct without waiting for an address. He already knew where they were going. Of course he did. George Parkin didn't leave anything to chance. Especially not her. Not anymore. The estate's master bathroom was all marble and chrome, a study in expensive minimalism that Ava had seen exactly twice in 6 years, both times to retrieve forgotten cufflinks before important meetings. Now she stood at the sink while George retrieved a first aid kit from beneath the counter. His movements deliberate and unhurried despite the hour approaching 1 a.m. Sit. He gestured to the closed toilet lid. Ava hesitated. In 6 years, George Parkin had never touched her beyond the occasional handshake or steadying hand at her elbow during charity galas. They maintained a careful distance, a professional buffer that kept the machinery of their working relationship pristine and efficient. What he was suggesting would shatter that boundary completely. Ava. His voice carried that edge of command she'd heard him use on men twice his size. Sit. She sat. George knelt before her, the motion incongruous with everything she knew about him. Mafia bosses didn't kneel. They didn't roll up the sleeves of their $1,000 shirts to reveal forearms marked with ink and old scars. They didn't open antiseptic wipes with the focused precision of a man who'd done this before, many times, under worse circumstances. He took her right hand first, turning it over to examine the split knuckles. His thumb traced the edge of the bruising with a gentleness that made her breath catch. You broke her orbital bone. She was reaching for a weapon. Ava's voice came out steadier than she felt. I saw the outline under her jacket. I know. George pressed the antiseptic to her knuckles. The sting made her flinch, but his grip remained steady. Marcus pulled the security footage. Self-defense, clearly. The charges won't stick. How did you get a judge to sign off at midnight? Something dark flickered across George's expression. Judge Morrison has a daughter at Westbrook Academy. Full scholarship. I make sure the donations committee looks favorably on her applications every year. He moved to her left hand, his touch maddeningly careful. People remember favors when you call them in at inconvenient hours. Ava watched him work, cataloging this shift in their dynamic. His hands were warm against her skin, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and smoke. She'd smelled it 1,000 times across desks and in elevators, but never this close. Never while his fingers wrapped around her wrist, holding her steady while he cleaned blood from her skin. Look up. George's free hand came to her chin, tilting her face toward the light. His jaw tightened as he examined the bruising along her cheekbone. She got a hit in. She was faster than I expected. The admission felt dangerous. Ava Wade didn't make tactical errors. She didn't underestimate opponents. I was distracted. By what? The ledger. I was so focused on securing it that I didn't see her coming until... She stopped as George pressed a cold compress to her cheek, his thumb resting against her jaw. The touch was professional, clinical. Except for the way his eyes had gone dark, the muscle jumping in his temple, the barely restrained tension in his shoulders. You could have been killed. The words came out quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made them more terrifying than if he'd shouted. Vanessa Sloan carries a blade. Spring-loaded, hidden in her bracelet. If she'd reached it before you struck. But she didn't. Because you were lucky. George's hand tightened fractionally against her face. Luck runs out, Ava. It always does. They stayed frozen like that, his hand cradling her bruised cheek, her pulse hammering against his thumb. 6 years of careful distance evaporating in the space between one breath and the next. Ava could see her reflection in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body despite the inches separating them. Mr. Parkin. George. His voice dropped lower. When you're bleeding in my bathroom at 1 in the morning, you call me George. The permission felt like crossing a threshold they could never uncross. Ava's throat went dry as his gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes, asking a question he'd apparently been holding back for 6 years. A question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Not yet. Thank you, she whispered. For coming. For all of this. George pulled back slowly, the compress still in her hand, his expression shuddering closed. Get some sleep. We'll debrief in the morning about what happened tonight. He stood, rolling his sleeves back down with practiced efficiency. The guest room is prepared. Second door on the left. He left before she could respond, the door clicking shut with careful control. Ava sat alone in the marble bathroom, her cleaned wounds throbbing, her heart racing, and the ghost of his touch still burning against her skin. Everything had changed, and they both knew it. Morning arrived wrapped in gray light, and the smell of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Ava found George in his study, already dressed in fresh clothing, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in clipped Mandarin. He gestured her in without breaking conversation, his eyes tracking her movement as she crossed to the leather chair opposite his desk. She'd borrowed one of his shirts, white Oxford, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a pair of sleep pants from the guest room dresser that someone, probably his housekeeper Mrs. Chun, had thoughtfully provided. The domesticity of wearing his clothes felt more intimate than last night's wound tending somehow. More permanent. George ended the call with a curt phrase and set the phone down with deliberate precision. Coffee's fresh. Mrs. Chun made breakfast, but I told her you'd eat when you were ready. His gaze lingered on the bruising along her cheekbone, now deep into purple. How are you feeling? Like I got into a fight with a Sloan. Ava reached into the pocket of the borrowed pants and withdrew a slim USB drive, setting it on the polished mahogany between them. But I got what we needed first. George's expression shifted, the concerned employer vanishing behind the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire on information. The ledger. Complete financial records for the past 18 months. Shell companies, offshore accounts, shipping manifests. Ava leaned forward, her voice dropping despite the empty house. They've been moving products through our routes, George. Using our infrastructure, our contacts, our distribution network. Someone's been feeding them real-time intelligence about our operations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. George picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers like he was weighing the gravity it represented. You're certain? Look at the dates. Ava had memorized the relevant entries during her sleepless hours in the guest room. March 15th, we lost the Vancouver shipment. The ledger shows a Sloan acquisition of pharmaceuticals, same weight, same day. June 22nd, our meeting with the Nakamura family got raided. The ledger has a payment to an RCMP contact 48 hours prior. September 3rd, the warehouse fire. George's jaw clenched. We thought it was an accident. It was arson, paid for with funds that trace back to a consulting firm we both recognize. Ava watched him process the implications, and saw the moment calculation turn to cold fury. Carter and Associates. The pen in George's hand snapped. He didn't seem to notice the ink bleeding across his palm. Carter and Associates was the financial consulting firm they used for legitimate business holdings, the buffer between the underground empire and the daylight world. It was also where 3 of George's most trusted advisors maintained offices. Who? The word came out flat, deadly. I don't know yet. The payments are routed through so many cutouts that it'll take time to trace. Ava pulled out her phone, pulling up the photo she'd taken of the ledger's most damning pages before the arrest. But there's a pattern. Whoever it is has access to your calendar, your meeting schedules, your private communications. They know things that only someone in your inner circle would know. George stood, moving to the window overlooking the estate's grounds. His silhouette against the gray morning light looked carved from stone. How many people have that level of access? 7, including me. Ava's throat tightened. Marcus Chun, your attorney. David Reeves, head of security. Patricia Ng, your accountant. James Harding, your logistics coordinator. Catherine Price, your public relations manager. Robert Zhang, your second in command. She paused. And me. It's not you. George didn't turn around. How can you be certain? Because you just handed me evidence that could hang you as an accomplice if the wrong people found it. Because you broke a Sloan soldier's face to protect that information. Because... He stopped, his reflection in the window showing an expression Ava couldn't quite read. Because I've watched you for 6 years, and you're many things, Ava Wade, but you're not a traitor. The conviction in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it sent a chill down her spine. George Parkin's certainty was dangerous. It was the same certainty that had built his empire, destroyed his enemies, and kept him alive through 2 decades of underworld warfare. And now that certainty was focused on protecting her. We need to smoke them out. Ava stood, moving to join him at the window. Whoever it is will know by now that I secured the ledger. They'll know the Sloanes failed to eliminate me last night. They'll be panicking. George's hand found hers, his ink-stained fingers threading through hers with a possessiveness that made her breath catch. Then we give them something to panic about. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. We make them think you're the only thing standing between them and exposure. You want to use me as bait. I want to catch a traitor. George turned to face her, his free hand coming up to cup her bruised cheek. But Ava, if we do this, there's no going back. You won't just be my assistant anymore. You'll be in the center of a war. She'd been in the center of his war for 6 years. The only difference was now he was admitting it. Then let's make sure we win. The restaurant was the kind of place where reservations required 6 weeks' notice and a background check. Le Corbeau occupied the top floor of a building George owned, which meant the entire establishment cleared out at 8 p.m. when they arrived. Just them, a pianist playing something melancholy in the corner, and a chef who'd won 3 Michelin stars before deciding he preferred cooking for dangerous men. Ava had returned to her apartment under armed escort that afternoon, retrieving clothes and her laptop while 2 of George's men swept for bugs. She'd chosen a black dress she bought for a charity gala 2 years ago and never worn. Silk that moved like water, with a neckline that walked the line between professional and provocative. George's eyes had lingered when she'd emerged from the guest room, his expression unreadable. Now they sat across from each other at a table set for 2, candles casting shadows across the white linen. It looked exactly like a date. It was supposed to look like a date. That was the point, to present a united front, to signal to whoever was watching that Ava Wade had transitioned from employee to something infinitely more valuable. The mole would be watching. They had to be. The cocoa vin is exceptional here. George's voice held that familiar professional distance, but his eyes told a different story. Though if you prefer seafood, the bouillabaisse is. George. Ava set down her wine glass. We're alone. You don't have to perform for me. Something shifted in his expression. He leaned back, the candlelight catching the silver at his temples, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. Almost. Force of habit. I've spent 6 years performing around you. What do you mean? The distance. The formality. He reached for his own glass, swirling the wine with studied casualness. Do you know why I never fired you? Even when my advisor suggested someone with more traditional qualifications? Ava's heart began to pound. Because I'm good at my job. Because you're exceptional at your job. Because you see 3 moves ahead. Because you've saved my life twice without me having to ask. George's gaze locked onto hers. And because if I'd let you go, I wouldn't have had an excuse to see you every day. The pianist transitioned into something slower, more intimate. Ava felt the words settling into her chest like stones. You kept me as your assistant to keep me close. I kept you as my assistant to keep you safe. The correction was quiet but absolute. The moment you became more than that, the moment anyone in my world understood what you actually meant to me, you'd have a target on your back. Look what happened the second the Sloanes realized you were important. One night, Ava. It took one night for them to try to eliminate you. So you've been. She struggled to process it. What, protecting me by pretending I don't matter? By pretending you're not the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing I see before I sleep. George's voice had gone rough around the edges. By not touching you the way I've wanted to for 4 years. By keeping you at arm's length when all I've wanted is. He stopped himself, jaw clenching. 4 years. Not 6. The distinction felt important. When did it change? Ava asked quietly. When did I stop being just your assistant? George was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the stem of his wine glass. Do you remember the Singapore deal? When Huang's men tried to renegotiate at gunpoint. She remembered. She'd stepped between George and the barrel of a gun, negotiating in Mandarin she'd taught herself specifically for that meeting. Her hand steady as she'd calmly pointed out that killing them both would collapse the entire supply chain. Huang had laughed and called her George's secret weapon, before agreeing to the original terms. You didn't even flinch. George's voice carried something that sounded almost like awe. Gun to your head, and you were calculating leverage points. That's when I knew. Knew what? That I was in serious trouble. His hand crossed the table, palm up, an invitation. Because you weren't just efficient or intelligent or capable. You were fearless. And I'd never met anyone who made me want to be anything other than what I am. Until you. Ava stared at his outstretched hand, her mind racing through 6 years of careful distance, professional courtesy, and the systematic burial of every inappropriate feeling she'd ever developed for her employer. Every time her heart jumped when he'd said her name. Every late night in the office when she'd caught herself watching him work. Every time she told herself it was just admiration, just respect, just the natural result of working closely with someone brilliant and dangerous and completely unavailable. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with the same possessiveness he'd shown at the precinct, in the bathroom, at the window that morning. Like he was claiming something that had always belonged to him but he'd finally decided to acknowledge. This isn't just performance anymore, is it? She whispered. It never was. George's thumb traced circles against her palm. Not for me. The question is whether you've been performing too, or if I've been alone in this for 4 years. The chef appeared with the first course, setting down plates of something that smelled divine. He disappeared again without a word, understanding that some conversations required privacy, even from staff who'd signed loyalty contracts in blood. Ava looked at the man across from her. Dangerous, powerful, completely focused on her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. And she realized the performance had been on both sides. She'd just been better at lying to herself about it. You weren't alone. The smile that crossed George's face was devastating. Ava was reviewing shipping manifests when the door to George's office exploded inward. No warning. No sound except the crack of splintering wood, and the whisper of a suppressed gunshot that punched through the leather chair where she'd been sitting 3 seconds earlier. Instinct had pulled her to the floor. Training she'd received from George's security team over the years kicked in as she rolled behind the desk, her hand already reaching for the panic button, hidden beneath the mahogany edge. The alarm was silent, but she knew it would flood the building with armed response within 90 seconds. The shooter moved into the room with professional efficiency. Black tactical gear, face obscured by a balaclava, weapon tracking methodically across the space. Looking for her. Ava's mind cataloged details even as her heart hammered. The way he moved suggested military training. The weapon was expensive, custom work, and the suppressor meant he'd planned to kill her quietly before anyone knew there was a threat. She was calculating her options when George appeared in the doorway. What happened next would replay in Ava's nightmares for weeks. George didn't hesitate, didn't call out a warning, didn't attempt negotiation. He simply moved, and the shooter's attention shifted a fraction too late. George's hand caught the weapon, redirecting it with brutal efficiency as his other hand drove into the man's throat with enough force that Ava heard cartilage crack from across the room. The shooter dropped, gasping, weapon clattering across the hardwood. George followed him down with a speed that seemed impossible for a man in a 3-piece suit. His knee drove into the man's chest, pinning him, and his hands, the same hands that had so carefully tended her wounds 2 nights ago, closed around the shooter's throat. Who sent you? George's voice was completely calm, clinical, the tone he used when discussing quarterly projections. The shooter tried to speak, but couldn't manage it through the pressure on his windpipe. George loosened his grip fractionally. I'll ask once more. Who sent you? Sloan. The word came out strangled. Marco Sloan. Paid $50,000. For proof she's dead. Proof. George's expression didn't change, But something in the air shifted. It became colder. Interesting word choice. He wanted confirmation, which means he doesn't trust the person who hired you. His hand tightened again. Who's your contact inside my organization? The shooter's eyes were starting to bulge. Ava realized with dawning horror that George wasn't interrogating him. He was killing him slowly, extracting information while the man suffocated. George. Stay behind the desk, Ava. He didn't look at her. His focus remained absolute on the dying man beneath him. Name. Now. Robert. Zhang. The shooter's voice was barely a whisper. You're second. He's the words cut off as George's hands closed completely. The shooter thrashed once, twice, then went still. George held the pressure for another 30 seconds, ensuring finality, before finally releasing and standing. He adjusted his cufflinks with the same precise movements he used after every meeting, as if he hadn't just killed a man with his bare hands in the middle of his office. Only then did he turn to Ava. His expression transformed, the cold efficiency melting into something fierce and protective and barely controlled. Are you hurt? She shook her head, unable to find words. She'd known what George was. She'd cleaned up after his work for 6 years, had orchestrated alibis and disappeared evidence and facilitated transactions that ended in bodies she never saw. But knowing abstractly and witnessing the violence firsthand were entirely different experiences. George crossed to her in 3 strides, pulling her up from behind the desk and into his arms with enough force that she gasped. His heart was racing against her ear, the only sign that he'd been affected at all by what just happened. Robert Zhang. His voice vibrated through his chest. My second in command. The man I trusted with everything. Ava pulled back enough to see his face. The fury there was incandescent. What are you going to do? I'm going to make him disappear. The words were soft, almost gentle, which somehow made them more terrifying. But first, I'm going to make sure everyone who works for me understands exactly what happens when they put you in danger. His thumb traced along her jaw, the same tender gesture from the bathroom, except now his hand still carried the warmth of the dead man on the floor. I need you to go to the safe house. Marcus will take you. I have to clean this up and deal with Robert before the Sloans realize their asset is compromised. George. This is the part where you see what I really am. His eyes searched hers, looking for disgust, fear, rejection. The part where keeping you safe means doing things that will probably give you nightmares. I won't apologize for it. I can't. Not when it comes to you. Ava looked at the body on the floor, at the man she loved who just killed to protect her, at the empire built on violence that she'd been helping maintain for 6 years. She thought about the ledger, about Robert Zhang's betrayal, about the target that would remain on her back until every threat was eliminated. Show me. Her voice came out steady, certain. Show me everything. If I'm going to be part of this world, I need to see all of it. The smile that crossed George's face was dark and approving and absolutely feral. My queen. He kissed her forehead, soft and reverent, before releasing her. Then watch carefully. This is how empires are defended. He pulled out his phone, his thumb already dialing as security flooded into the room. Marcus. I need a cleanup crew and a location for Robert Zhang. And prepare the warehouse on 5th. We're going to have a conversation about loyalty. The war had begun, and Ava had just chosen her side. The villa sat 30 miles outside the city, hidden behind iron gates and enough security cameras to monitor a small country. Ava watched the landscape blur past the car window as Marcus drove in silence, George's hand wrapped around hers like a vice. He hadn't let go since they'd left the office, since he'd watched his security team wrap the shooter's body in plastic and carry Robert Zhang screaming from the building. She hadn't asked what George planned to do to his former second-in-command. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. The villa was all stone and glass. Expensive minimalism that felt more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. George gave her a tour with clinical efficiency. Reinforced windows, panic room, armed guards rotating every 6 hours. He was in protection mode, the part of him that calculated risk and eliminated variables. The part that had kept him alive for 2 decades in a world designed to kill men like him. You'll be safe here. He stood in the master bedroom, hands in his pockets, looking everywhere except at her. I've handled the Zhang situation. The Sloanes will know by morning that their inside access is gone. They'll regroup, which gives us time to. George. Ava crossed to him, her reflection multiplying in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Stop. Stop what? Treating me like a problem to be managed. She reached for his tie, loosening it with fingers that had learned the motion from watching him do it 1,000 times. I'm not one of your assets. His hands caught hers, stilling them against his chest. His heart was racing beneath the expensive fabric. You're more important than any asset I've ever protected. Which is exactly why you need to stay here until. Until what? Until you've eliminated every threat? Until the Sloanes are gone? Until your world is safe? Ava's voice sharpened with frustration. That's never going to happen, George. There will always be another rival family, another mole, another shooter. You can't lock me away every time someone decides I'm valuable. I can try. His grip tightened. Do you have any idea what it was like watching that door explode? Knowing someone was trying to kill you? If I'd been 30 seconds later. But you weren't. She pulled one hand free, cupping his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. I'm here. I'm alive. Because of you. This time. The words came out raw. What about next time? What about when I'm not there? Then I handle it myself. Like I've been doing for 6 years. Ava held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. You said you wanted me to see everything. To be part of this world. But you can't have it both ways, George. Either I'm your partner or I'm your prisoner. Choose. Something broke in his expression. The careful control shattered, and what emerged underneath was hunger and fear and a possessiveness that should have terrified her. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones with a reverence that contradicted the intensity in his eyes. I choose you. His voice dropped to a whisper. Even if it destroys me. Even if keeping you means watching you walk into danger. Even if. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. 6 years of restraint and 4 years of wanting and 2 days of violence exploded between them. George's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer as he backed her toward the bed with an urgency that spoke of barely controlled need. The kiss deepened, turned desperate, and Ava felt herself falling into it. Into him. With the same reckless certainty she'd felt when she'd chosen to stand beside him despite the blood on the floor. They broke apart, breathing hard. Foreheads pressed together. The tension between them transformed into something electric and inevitable. George's hand shook slightly as they traced down her sides, and she realized this scared him more than any rival family or betrayal or assassination attempt. This surrender. This vulnerability. I need you to understand something. His voice was rough against her ear. The moment we do this, there's no going back. You won't just be in my world. You'll be my world. And I protect what's mine with everything I have. I know. Ava pulled back enough to meet his eyes, her hands already working at the buttons of his shirt. I'm counting on it. His laugh was dark and almost relieved. My queen. My absolutely fearless, infuriating queen. He caught her hands, bringing them to his lips. If you want to be my partner, then we do this right. Tomorrow we will hunt the Sloanes together. Tonight. Tonight you stop trying to protect me from yourself. She freed her hands, pushing his shirt off his shoulders. I've seen what you are, George. I chose you anyway. The last of his control snapped. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hands mapping the curves of her body with the same possessive intensity he brought to everything he claimed. They fell onto the bed in a tangle of expensive fabric in desperate need, and for the first time in 6 years, there was no professional distance between them, no careful boundaries, no pretense. Just George and Ava, finally honest about what they'd been dancing around since Singapore. Since the first time she'd stepped between him and a bullet without flinching. Since he'd realized that keeping her meant risking everything he'd built. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter. Security cameras monitored every approach. The war with the Sloanes continued. But inside the villa's master bedroom, wrapped in each other, they carved out a moment of peace in a world defined by violence. Tomorrow they'd be partners in the empire. Tonight, they were simply two people who'd waited far too long to admit the truth. The protection could wait until morning. Ava woke to an empty bed and a message on George's pillow. 3 words in his precise handwriting. Meeting with Nakamura. She checked her phone. 4:47 a.m. He'd left without waking her, which meant he wanted her safe behind the villa's walls while he handled business. She was pulling on clothes when her laptop pinged with an alert. The monitoring software she'd installed on George's server, her own private insurance policy, had flagged an encrypted message sent from Marcus Chen's account 30 minutes ago. Her stomach dropped. Not Marcus. Anyone but Marcus. The encryption was sophisticated, but Ava had spent 6 years learning George's security systems from the inside. She cracked it in 12 minutes, and what she found made her blood run cold. Nakamura meeting is a setup. Parkin will be alone at the 5th Street warehouse at 6 a.m. The Sloane team is authorized for termination. Fee upon confirmation. Marcus Chun, George's attorney, the man who'd bailed her out of jail, who'd secured the midnight judge's signature, who'd been at George's side for 8 years. The message had been sent to a known Sloane proxy, and the meeting with Nakamura, there was no meeting. It was bait to get George isolated. Ava was running before conscious thought caught up. She grabbed her phone, dialing George's number as she sprinted for the garage. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. He'd either turned it off or someone had jammed the signal. The villa's security tried to stop her. She used George's override code, the one he thought she didn't know, and was behind the wheel of his backup Mercedes before they could coordinate a response. The gates opened automatically, recognizing the vehicle, and she was speeding toward the city before anyone could raise the alarm. She tried Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sleep-rough and convincing. Ava? What's wrong? Where's George? She took a corner too fast, tires screaming. The Nakamura meeting, I assume. He left an hour ago. Why? What happened? Perfect. Too perfect. The concern in his voice, the confusion, the immediate offer to help. Marcus Chun had been playing them both, and he was good enough that she'd never suspected. Nothing. False alarm. Go back to sleep. She ended the call before he could respond, her mind racing. 5th Street warehouse. 20 minutes if she broke every traffic law. George had maybe 30 before the Sloanes arrived, if they weren't already there. She was 5 blocks from the warehouse when the SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. Black, no plates, closing fast. Ava's hands tightened on the wheel as she pushed the accelerator down, but the Mercedes wasn't built for pursuit. The SUV rammed her from behind, and she fought to keep control as it struck again, harder. The third impact sent her spinning. The Mercedes hit a lamppost with a crunch of metal and the explosive deployment of airbags. Ava tasted blood, her vision swimming as she tried to orient herself. The driver's door was wrenched open, and hands dragged her from the wreckage before she could reach the gun in the glove compartment. She fought, connected with someone's jaw, felt ribs crack under her elbow, heard cursing in 3 languages. But there were too many of them, and the crash had left her disoriented. Something sharp pricked her neck, a needle, and her limbs turned to lead. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Marcus Chun stepping out of the SUV's passenger seat, his expression apologetic and utterly devoid of the warmth she'd always associated with him. I'm sorry, Ava. You weren't supposed to figure it out this quickly. George. Her voice slurred, the sedative pulling her under. We'll walk into an ambush thinking he's meeting allies. Marcus crouched beside her, his hand almost gentle as it brushed hair from her face. The Sloanes wanted him distracted before they made their move. You were always the perfect distraction. He's so busy protecting you that he's stopped watching his back. Ava tried to speak, to scream, to warn George somehow, but the darkness was complete and unforgiving. Her last coherent thought was that she'd broken the cardinal rule of George's world. She trusted the wrong person. And now George would die because of it. Marcus lifted her easily, carrying her toward the SUV as his team swept the crash scene for evidence. Take her to the secondary location. Marco wants her alive for the exchange. He glanced at his watch. We have 45 minutes before Parkin realizes something's wrong. Make sure she's secure by then. And someone jam all signals within a mile radius of the 5th Street warehouse. I don't want any unexpected interruptions. The SUV door closed, sealing Ava inside with armed guards who looked at her with the cold assessment of men who killed for a living. Through the tinted windows she caught one last glimpse of the warehouse in the distance, the place where George was walking into a trap, completely unaware that his most trusted advisor had sold him out. The sedative dragged her deeper into unconsciousness, and she went under cursing her own stupidity. She'd seen the ledger, tracked the payments, identified the pattern. But she'd been looking at Robert Zhang, at the obvious suspect, while the real mole smiled and offered legal counsel and planned their destruction from the inside. Marcus Chun had played them perfectly, and now they would both pay the price. Ava woke to the smell of mildew and salt water. Her head throbbed where it had struck the dashboard, and the zip ties around her wrists had already cut circulation to her fingers. She was in some kind of warehouse, abandoned judging by the rust and decay, with water lapping somewhere below. The shipping district. Perfect place to disappear someone. Marco Sloan sat across from her on a metal folding chair, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of a man waiting for his pizza delivery. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with a kind of manufactured charm that came from expensive schools and family money built on blood. 2 guards flanked the door, automatic weapons held with professional casualness. You're awake. Marco didn't look up from his phone. Good. My father wants proof of life before he authorizes the exchange. Exchange. Ava's voice came out rough. She worked saliva into her dry mouth, buying time to assess her situation. The zip ties were industrial grade, but they'd bound her hands in front. Amateur mistake. The guards were watching Marco, not her. And Marco's phone sat loosely in his hand, unlocked, unprotected. You for Parkin's cooperation. He dismantles his shipping network, transfers his accounts, and walks away. Simple transaction. Marco finally glanced at her, his eyes empty of empathy. Though between us, my father doesn't plan to honor the agreement. The moment George signs everything over, you both die. But don't worry, it'll be quick. Professional. Professional. Ava shifted, testing the zip ties. They bit deeper into her wrists. Like Marcus Chen's betrayal? That was your father's work. Marcus was insured. Robert Zhang was the real asset, but George figured him out too quickly. Marco's smile was all teeth. You're very good at your job, Ms. Wade. Shame you wasted 6 years working for a dead man. The casual cruelty in his voice ignited something cold and calculating in Ava's chest. She'd spent 6 years learning George's empire from every angle, including the intelligence she'd gathered on rival families. The Sloans had weaknesses. She'd cataloged them all. Your offshore accounts are in Grand Cayman, Shell Corporation called Pacific Meridian Holdings. She kept her voice conversational, watching Marco's expression shift. Routing number 103847562. Primary account manager is David Rothstein, who's been skimming 2% off every transaction for the past 3 years. Your father doesn't know. But I do. Marco's hand tightened on his phone. You're bluffing. Your weapons shipment arriving Tuesday is coming through Vancouver Port. Container MSCU 8473012. Canadian Customs has been paid off through an intermediary named Sullivan, who's actually an RCMP informant. That shipment will be seized the moment it touches Canadian soil. Ava leaned forward, ignoring the screaming pain in her shoulders. Want me to keep going? How? Because I've been tracking your family for 2 years, mapping every asset, every transaction, every vulnerability. Her smile was sharp enough to cut. George doesn't just react to threats. He anticipates them. And I'm the one who does the anticipating. Marco stood abruptly, crossing to her with manufactured calm. His hand cracked across her face hard enough that she tasted blood. You think information gives you leverage? You're tied up in a warehouse about to be traded like cattle. And you're about to watch your father's empire collapse. Ava spit blood onto his expensive shoes. Because unlike you, I didn't come here unprepared. She'd been conscious for 30 seconds before opening her eyes. Long enough to feel the burner phone she'd slipped into her bra before leaving the villa. The one George had given her for emergencies. Long enough to press the emergency beacon twice with her bound hands, activating the GPS tracker that would lead him straight here. Long enough to start the voice recorder that was now capturing every word Marco said. The SEC is auditing Pacific Meridian next week. Anonymous tip about money laundering, complete with transaction records I compiled 6 months ago. Ava held his gaze. Your Vancouver shipment is already compromised. Your accountant is stealing from you. And your precious Marcus Chen? George didn't walk into that ambush. He sent Robert Zhang's body instead, dressed in his coat, wearing his watch. Robert's betrayal bought him one last bit of usefulness. Marco's face went white. You're lying. Your phone. Ava nodded toward it. Check your encrypted messages. Marcus should have confirmed George's death by now. Except he won't, because George is very much alive and very aware of who actually betrayed him. Marco's hand shook as he grabbed his phone. Ava watched his expression crumble as he scrolled through messages, or more accurately, the lack of them. No confirmation from Marcus. No updates from the ambush team. Just silence. What did you do? His voice dropped to something dangerous. I gave George exactly what he needed. 12 hours head start, and a complete map of your organization. Ava smiled despite the blood in her mouth. You wanted to use me as leverage? Congratulations. You just invited a wolf into your house and showed him where you sleep. The warehouse door exploded inward with the same violence that had started this entire nightmare. George walked through the smoke and debris like an avenging angel dressed in black, flanked by 20 armed men who moved with military precision. David Reeves directed teams to secure the perimeter while George's eyes found Ava across the warehouse, cataloging her injuries with cold fury. Marco reached for his weapon. He never cleared leather. George's shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him. The guards tried to raise their weapons but were cut down before they could fire. The entire engagement lasted 15 seconds. Then George was kneeling before her, cutting the zip ties with a knife pulled from his belt, his hands checking for injuries with barely controlled desperation. You led me straight to them. I told you. Ava's voice was steady despite everything. I'm not a victim. I'm your partner. His laugh was brief and fierce. My queen. He pulled her to her feet, supporting her weight as feeling returned to her hands. Ready to finish this? Ava looked at Marco bleeding on the concrete, at the Sloan Empire about to crumble, at the man she loved who'd moved heaven and earth to find her. Let's burn it all down. The Sloan estate burned beautifully. Orange flames reflected in the lake beyond, turning the water to liquid copper as George's team systematically dismantled what had taken 3 generations to build. Financial accounts frozen by morning. Shipping routes absorbed. Key personnel either recruited or disappeared. By dawn, the Sloan Syndicate would exist only as a cautionary tale about what happened when you made an enemy of George Parkin. Ava stood on the terrace of George's estate, watching the distant glow on the horizon. Her wrists were bandaged, her face still bruised, but she'd refused the hospital. There would be time for medical attention after they'd finished breaking their enemies. Marcus Chun had been found in a shipping container bound for Singapore, alive barely, with enough evidence of his betrayal carved into his skin that he'd never work in anyone's organization again. The Nakamura family had sent formal apologies and a very generous gift after learning their name had been used in the deception. George emerged from his study, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He'd shed his tactical gear for a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and somehow looked more dangerous in casual clothes than in body armor. He passed her a glass and stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Marcus will survive. His voice held no particular emotion. I made sure of it. Death would have been mercy. And Marco, transferred to his father's custody this morning, along with the evidence of Pacific Meridian's money laundering, the customs informant's testimony, and detailed records of every Sloan operation for the past 3 years. George's smile was cold satisfaction. His father will handle the rest internally. I imagine Marco's life expectancy is measured in days, not years. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their enemies burn. It should have felt wrong, the violence, the destruction, the calculated brutality of it all. Instead, Ava felt a savage sense of completion. This was George's world. Her world now. And they defended it together. I had the documents drawn up this afternoon. George reached into his pocket, withdrawing a leather folder. Partnership agreement. 50-50 split of all holdings. Full authority over operations. Complete access to everything I own. He set it on the terrace wall between them. You're not my assistant anymore, Ava. You haven't been for a long time. Ava picked up the folder, scanning the legal language that transformed her from employee to equal. Her name beside his on every page. Joint signing authority. Shared liability. It was more than a business arrangement. It was a declaration that she'd earned her place through blood and intelligence and 6 years of unwavering loyalty. Your advisors will hate this. She closed the folder, meeting his eyes. My advisors work for me. For us. George's hand found hers, threading their fingers together. The ones who have a problem with it can follow Marcus and Robert into early retirement. And the ones who stay? I will learn very quickly that you're not just the woman who shares my bed. His voice dropped lower, intimate despite the open air. You're the one who sees the threats I miss. Who tracks our enemies while I eliminate them. Who turned a kidnapping into an intelligence coup that dismantled an entire rival family. He turned to face her fully, his free hand cupping her bruised jaw with infinite care. You're my queen, Ava. And it's time everyone knew it. She'd spent 6 years being invisible, being efficient, being the perfect assistant who anticipated needs and disappeared problems. She'd buried her feelings and her ambitions and her desire for this man under layers of professionalism so thick she'd almost convinced herself they weren't real. Almost. I want everything in writing. Her voice was steady, certain. Partnership agreement, succession plans, contingencies if one of us dies or is incapacitated. I want our positions formalized in every document, every contract, every deal. George's smile was devastating. Already done. Marcus's replacement starts Monday. A lawyer who specializes in power transfers. She'll have everything ready for signature within the week. Patricia recommended her. Says she's ruthless, brilliant, and has no interest in being bought. His thumb traced along her jaw. Sound like anyone you know? Ava laughed despite everything. The violence, the betrayal, the near-death experience that should have sent her running. Instead, she was standing on a terrace watching enemies burn, while planning the future of a criminal empire. And she'd never felt more certain of anything in her life. Then let's make it official. She raised her whiskey glass. To the new empire. George touched his glass to hers, the crystal ringing clear in the night air. To us. The terrifying, brilliant, absolutely unstoppable us. He drank, then set his glass aside to pull her close. I love you, Ava Wade. My partner. My queen. The woman who makes me want to conquer the world just to lay it at your feet. I love you too. The words felt dangerous and right. My Mafia boss. My partner. The man who killed me and then handed me half his empire. They kissed as the Sloan estate collapsed in the distance. As their enemies scattered. As a new chapter began. 6 years of careful distance had led to this, standing together in the darkness, building something that would make the entire underworld take notice. George Parkin and Ava Wade. No longer boss and assistant. No longer employer and employee. Partners in every sense that mattered. Ruling an empire built on intelligence and violence, and a love forged in the fires of betrayal. The midnight call that had started everything felt like a lifetime ago. Now, as dawn approached, they stood ready to face whatever came next. Together. Equal. Unstoppable. The new empire had begun. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It is as crazier and more intriguing as I can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Please don't forget to subscribe.